assume most of you are familiar with this gentleman, Shem Phillips, one of the top Kiwi board designers and board game designers, and just really a legend in the industry. And I think, as we all know, with a really unique style of games in their artwork and their play, and also the trilogy aspect of it as well, which they're iconic, really. So we're very privileged. So thank you very much, Shem, for joining us here. And do you want to I think most people probably know your history, but do you just want to give us a short background on how you got started? I've heard this in several of the interviews before, but if you don't mind repeating it, it would be great.
All good. Yeah, so I got started designing games about 14 years ago. And just wanted to make a few games myself, just as a hobby. I wasn't making any money off them or anything. I was making a few hundred copies here and there. And then about 6 years into that as a hobby, I discovered Kickstarter, which came to New Zealand at that point, and launched my first game, Shipwrights of the North Sea, on Kickstarter, which actually ended up doing quite well, like more than I expected. And then from there, I sort of did more games and established a company, and then the rest is kind of, as you see, history, building these trilogies and all sorts. So it's been a crazy journey, but basically just took a hobby and made it into a company, into a business.
So what's the motivation for you? What's the board game appeal? What I mean, obviously you started that way, but what does this go back to childhood?
Yeah, I grew up playing all the classic games like Cluedo and Monopoly and Scrabble, and just classic card games like Rummy style games, Mahjong, that kind of stuff. So I always enjoyed games, enjoyed puzzles, enjoyed maths at school, problem solving and that kind of stuff. So that's kind of where it came from. And I think the attraction to board games for me is how it mixes both that kind of analytical, mathematic kind of side of your brain with the creative and the art and the visual stuff as well. So that kind of meshing is what I enjoy about it. And also that you're kind of in the game, you're playing the game, you're making things change rather than just sitting back and watching a movie. It's interactive. Yeah.
So since we have out here today your new version of Shipwrights, can you give us a little bit of history? Because that was your first major game, was the original Shipwrights. And would you be able to talk a little bit about that, the genesis of that, how it led to the North Sea trilogy, and it's a long question, and how you've wound up redoing this game?
Yeah, so I think I first started designing that one something like 11 or 12 years ago. I had this idea for a game about building ships. Didn't have a theme in mind at that point. But when I was working on the mechanisms for the game, I kind of landed on this idea of having 3 resources for building the ships. I can't remember why, I just landed on that idea. And then started researching like what ships out there need just 3 resources. And that led me to discover that the Viking longships were mostly oak, wool, and iron to make them. I was like, well, that fits my kind of mechanical hook, I guess. And then when I did some more research into the Vikings, I realized there were all these cool ship names. There's like 12 to 15 different ship types. And then of course, you've got berserkers and shield maidens, all these cool characters that you can bring into the games. So that's when I was like, this is definitely a Viking game. That's kind of how I got started. And after doing that first game on Kickstarter, people were sort of commenting before it was even out, just saying, well, it's great that we can build these Viking ships, but why can't we go raiding with them? Why can't we use them for anything? I think the History Channel Viking show was very popular at that time. So it was like, Vikings, go raiding. So I started designing the second game just after Shipwrights was on Kickstarter, called Raiders of the North Sea. And then that one got really a lot of attention, was very popularly, received by reviewers and by people. And then in my mind, I was like, why would I just do 2 games? Why not do a trilogy of games? Just sort of round it out, finish off this project. And that's when I thought, well, let's do Explorers. It makes sense. You build the ships, you raid nearby settlements, then you go abroad and start, settling down. And then I guess towards the end of that, I was thinking, well, there's the North Sea. Can I go east or west or south next? And now I've got my whole next 8 years of my life planned out for me. So that's where I am at the moment. And I guess, yeah, the coming back to Shipwrights to do the Redux. So that was, about 9 years ago, I think it was released. And there's a lot of flaws in that game because I was a very fresh designer, didn't know what I was doing. A lot of things I would change in that game. And I actually tried to redesign it a few times, but I couldn't really fix it. I was trying to patch it with an expansion or something. And eventually ended up going, I need to make this game new, just brand new game, change it completely. because whenever people talk about, say, the West Kingdom, they go, oh, that's a great solid trilogy. And they talk about the North, they often just go, Raiders is great, but yeah, the other ones, I don't like shipwrights, and they just move on. So it always annoyed me that that the North Sea had this kind of stigma to it in a way, or just, that it wasn't as good as the West. So I wanted to go back and fix that for my own personal taste, I guess.
Just on a personal level, I actually bought as a thank you gift Explorers for a friend, and I'm actually quite surprised that doesn't you mentioned a few other interviews, it doesn't seem to get the love, and I actually find it pretty solid, and I probably obviously a bit more approachable than say Viscounts.
Yeah, it's definitely more approachable. I still really enjoy that game. I wouldn't change anything about it. I think it just kind of got hidden in the shadow of Raiders, because the year that Explorers came out, Raiders got nominated for the Kenishfield Yaras Award, so that was like a huge thing. So Explorers was kind of forgotten about, but it is lighter, but I still love it.
On the subject of Raiders, just going a little off, my experience with Raiders is actually from the app. It was Tom Vassell on the Dice Tower reviewed. It was from Direwolf, and he talked about they did Root, and they've now done Everdell, and they did Raiders, and he just gushed. He thought they were the best board game ports he'd ever seen, and having played with it, they're fantastic. And I'm wondering, how did that come about, and do you think there'll be some more of that?
Yeah, they are really, really good apps. We have a US partner, Renegade Game Studios, so they handle all of our international and mostly North American distribution for our games. And they partner with Direwolf. So you've probably heard of Clank. So Direwolf Digital designed Clank, and they also did the new Dune Imperium game. So they're already a partner with Renegade. So it was kind of through their partnership, they just said, well, we can get the rights to doing Raiders as an app. So it was easy. Direwolf fronted all the upfront costs for development, and then once they covered the costs with royalties, making sales, then they'd eventually start paying us some royalties for that as well. So it was free for us, which is fantastic, and it means more people are playing the game.
And then so now you've got, we know about the West Kingdom trilogy, and you've got the South Tigris, but which we have out there for demos, by the way, today. But let's just go a bit in the future. I've heard that you're going to continue on to, is it Byzantium at this point? Was that what I'd heard?
Yeah, the East will be the Byzantine Empire. So we're still very fresh in that. We've got some story ideas for the games, but we haven't started designing them yet. So.
Are you going to end there, or is there going to be somewhere in the center of the compass?
There is always this joke about doing the 13th game where there's like the 4 different factions fighting each other, but who knows? I know Sam McDonald, my co-designer, he wants to do like a 5th trilogy, but I don't think I have it in me to do that, so we'll find out.
Can you talk about the trilogies as well? I mean, there's this thematic thing, and we as gamers love it, but is there, you're running a business. Is this become kind of a branding thing for you as well? You think?
Yeah, there's a few good reasons to do it. One is the branding. Like, people see the box cover, they know what to expect. They see it like, oh, it's probably a 1 to 4 player Euro game that plays in about 2 hours. You just kind of know what you're going to get when you see the box. So that helps. But also it means that when we're still selling the 2nd and the 3rd game in a trilogy, people are then going back to buy the 1st game. So it means that the games have a longer shelf life. So it's just smart business from that point. The downside is that it can start to feel a bit samey. So people do go, oh, I've seen that box before, but it's not actually the game they've played before. So we try and make them stand out if we can. But from the outside, not knowing anything about the series, they're going to look very samey, and people get a bit overwhelmed not knowing where to jump in. So that there is a downside to it, but it's been mostly positive for us for the brand side of things.
Can you talk a little bit about with each of the trilogies and the ones you're going to move forward on? It seems like there's kind of a mechanic that you're featuring. I'm looking at South Tigris. It seems like dice is now playing a role. Is that by intent, or is each one have kind of a mechanical thematic element to it? Can you talk about that?
Very, very intentional. So the North Sea was me just doing stuff. I didn't really have a plan. I mean, Shipwrights wasn't even designed with a trilogy in mind, so I was just fumbling my way through it. And then with Architects, we designed this virtue corruption system for the game. And we sort of thought, well, that'll be fun to do something similar in the 2nd game in Paladins. And then, of course, in the 3rd game, Viscounts. So we had this kind of virtue corruption, criminals kind of vibe going on in the West. And we really like those systems with the debts and the deeds, and you can flip them, and you can be like the bad player, the corrupt, but then kind of redeem yourself towards the end. We liked how that gave players like more agency in the game. But when we got to the south, we thought we can't do that stuff anymore. We can't keep repeating that same system. You need something fresh, something to like make it stand apart. And so we started defining what each trilogy was. So the north is all about, you have your crew, you have strength, there's Valkyrie. The west is about virtue, corruption, criminals, that kind of stuff. And then the south, we thought, let's give it a real defined mechanism, which was the dice. So all three games have dice, mostly dice placement in them, and dice manipulation and that kind of stuff, coloring dice and scholars. And then so for the east, we'll definitely have something else that makes that stand apart, because other than the theme and the box cover changing color, there's nothing else to really like differentiate the trilogies. So we want to make sure they have sort of mechanical hooks that make them stand apart as well.
Cool. And I just lost my train of thought here. Oh yes. Going back to the North Sea, one of the things that I think was fairly iconic for people was the way you riffed on worker placement, with the idea of place a worker and pull a worker back. And then in Architects, I remember this from the game I just played recently with Jeremy over there, and getting put in jail a lot. So what's really interesting is, like, unlike a lot of other worker placement games, you take this very, mechanic we've known for a while and have taken it in different places. How did that come about in the various ways you've worked with worker placement?
It's usually just because we're not trying to copy anything. Like, we don't want to make the same game again. So it's hard to innovate, because the more you innovate, the more the game becomes too complex and convoluted, because no one knows what you meant to do in the game. So people like familiarity in games. I like things they can quickly grasp and know, like, say, let's draft some cards. Most board gamers know, I know what drafting is. So it's a simple concept. And placing a worker is a very simple concept. It's like when we were younger playing games, the idea was like, you get the dice, you roll the dice on your turn, that's kind of what you did on your turn. So I think placing a worker has almost replaced that in its simplicity, that for a Euro game, on your turn, you place a worker. Or maybe it's play a card on your turn, that kind of stuff. So when we're trying to make a new game with a fresh feel, it's more about taking what you know and then trying to give it a bit of a twist so that it feels fresh, without changing up the entire system of like how games are meant to function. Because we don't want to do the same game over and over again. We want to keep them fresh. You want to give it a reason to exist, I guess, the game, not just be a clone of something else, and sort of bring something new to the conversation from board game design.
So with that in mind, do you, games outside of your own that you play, how much do you draw inspiration from them? Do you have particular classic titles that still appeal, and more contemporary ones that you, whether you're taking influence them or not, but that you appreciate, or who are the some of the designers that kind of?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I play a lot of games. That is where the inspiration comes from. Is the more you play, the more tools and mechanisms you can learn and think about using in future games. Not to rip off stuff, but to be inspired by it, So early on, I was playing a lot of Citadels, found Ticket to Ride quite early, obviously Catan, Carcassonne, they're all classic ones, classic Euro style games. These days, Underwater Cities, Lost Ruins of Arnak, Great Western Trail, I sort of sit more in that medium to heavy Euro game. It's my kind of favorite place to be. I like my brain to burn a little bit. But I really appreciate lighter games like Love Letter. Is an amazing game because it's so simple. It's like 16 cards. It's a whole game. So yeah, and I like the big Ameritrash stuff, dungeon crawlers and stuff as well. So I think it's good to try lots of different games because you learn different things from different styles. But my favorite genre would definitely be a Euro style game.
So with that in mind as well, so some of your other games, which I guess are Sam games as well, Circadians and that area, the non-trilogy games, so to speak. Yep. Where do they fit into your genre? So I haven't played either of them, so.
Yeah, so most our games are Euro games. With the Circadians line, it's our sci-fi kind of universe. First Light is a dice worker placement game, very engine building Euro game. Chaos Order was the second game in that series, and that's a big dudes on a map area control game, very fighty, but highly asymmetric and very complex. So it's a big sort of 3 to 4 hour slogfest. But it's got a lot of Euro mechanisms in it as well, lots of engine building and stuff. And then the other line we have is our Ancient Anthology, which is Raiders of Scythia, Hadrian's Wall, Lexia of You, and then Ezra and Nehemiah coming out next year. That's very similar to our medieval stuff. But obviously trying to set it in an ancient setting. with my brother's artwork, but they're mostly Euro games as well. But we are kind of a bit freer to do different things in that series, whereas the medieval trilogies kind of have to be like that same style of game because we have the saga systems that we use for them, so you can play them back to back. So with the ancient anthology, we've done solo only game. We could do co-ops, we could do area control, any kind of stuff. We could do different things, which is fun. We could explore more and have more fun designing.
So speaking of which, one of the ones in your ancient anthology is Legacy of You, which is your first and only, as far as I know, solo only game. What prompted you to go down the exclusively solo route?
So that actually started from my first attempt to redesign shipwrights. I had some ideas. I wanted to change up the game slightly, and it was working fun as a solo game. I basically designed a solo mode for shipwrights, then tweaked it from there, and then I sort of took it to my game group and we played it multiplayer, and I just realized all the same flaws from the original game are still there. It's still frustrating to play and things don't work. So I kind of gave up on that, but there were some new things I developed while making that solo version of the game, which was quite fun still. So I took those ideas and then made Legacy of You, which is why if you play Shipwrights, which is out in the foyer, wherever it is, it has a similar DNA to Legacy of You because it kind of was inspired by the same starting point. But I love solo gaming myself. I do a lot of solo testing, obviously, for our board games. So I like just being able to play a game in like 20, 30 minutes and get into it. So it was fun because it was the system I had for Legacy of You was this sort of deck management as your health, or deck as your health kind of system, which doesn't really work for multiplayer. If it's a big threat system that the more your deck goes down, the worse things get. So I had to be solo unless I changed the core system. But it was a good challenge because I had a friend who was a really good writer. I thought I could just do a campaign. He could write the whole story. It was a really fun project to do, just to satisfy my own desire to do a solo game. Yeah.
So was the campaign aspect something that was that not from the start, that kind of developed as you went on? And what motivated you to go down that route?
So I had this sort of core game that was working really well, and the solo game by itself. I took it up to the Game Artisans Retreat in Piha a couple of years ago, which is like a group of 18 designers from around New Zealand, mostly Auckland though, at this retreat for 3 nights. And I actually watched one of my friends, Paul from Badgers from Mars, play the game. And his emotions, like his roller coaster of like losing and winning the game, was so fun to watch that I knew I was onto something good. It was just so entertaining. It was like 1 o'clock in the morning. He was just like shouting and screaming, and it was great. So I knew I had a good game at that point. But I think it was the Sunday before we left, we were just sitting around the lounge chatting, and Sven from Cheap Sheep Games was talking about legacy elements and that kind of stuff. We're talking about how to do things differently, and that kind of got me thinking, well, maybe I could do a campaign for this. Like, I've got time. I'm not pushed to make this game release anytime soon. So maybe I could turn this solo game into a campaign. And then it was like the next sort of 4 to 6 months was developing that.
Cool. Any questions out there? Yes, come on up.
Hey, you've kind of brushed on it already on a few things, but could you talk a bit about how do you normally start with, the sort of lore idea, or do you start with a cool mechanic and think, okay, where does this apply?
Yeah, so early on, I would start with mechanisms. When I first started designing, just like how could I use dice differently? How could I use cards or tiles differently? And it's sort of, you can take your inspiration from anywhere, really. It doesn't matter where you start from, and it all ends up being the same. But when we're doing games like for the West Kingdom or the South Tigris, we have a very clear world like in mind. So we do have the setting already there, and then it's about finding mechanisms. So my usual way now is to actually have setting, which is just like broad. It's not a story. Maybe it's like a sort of a cap of a story. Like, this is roughly where we are and who we are. And then from there, I'll try and figure out the mechanisms, which is the most important part in a Euro game. And then once we have the setting and the mechanisms working, that's when I start thinking more about the actual story. Like, what is the theme, like, as players, and what are you trying to achieve in the game? And then that should go hand in hand with the mechanisms and be inspiring each other. So when you've got the setting, start with the story mechanisms, and then kind of work together to the final product. So I think it's good to do both at the same time. That's basically what I'm saying. But usually start with some rough kind of setting to where the game might be. But in saying that, sometimes you just have a cool mechanism and then you have to find something that fits for it. But it should always sort of feel like it connects to the mechanisms, I think.
When you're experimenting with designing new mechanics and new rules, how much consideration do you give to explaining those rules to players? And is there any mechanics that you would back away from because you think that they'd be too complicated to try and explain?
That's always a challenge. It's like they've got this cool idea for this cool thing with dice, and it gets way too convoluted to actually explain the game. I think Wayfarers is probably a good example of a game that's just like almost too complex, to the point that like we love playing it. Once you know the rules, it's great. But I almost dread teaching the game because it's a lot to explain up front. I think Hadrian's Wall can be like that with some people as well. A lot of upfront rules can whereas the game itself is quite simple. So I'm definitely conscious of it more and more as we keep designing games. But even from early on, I was always thinking how can we make things more intuitive? I think that's a good question to ask when you're designing. I've got this thing that works. Could it be more intuitive, with the UI, with the icons, or just taking out elements? It's always good to keep taking away until a good question to ask yourself is when you're making a game is, if I took that thing away, would the game still feel the same? Does it actually improve the game being there? Another good question to ask is, are these additional rules that you're adding, do they justify a better experience for the game? So if you're adding more rules, more complexity, things to teach, is it actually making the game better? Or if you took them out, would the game be better? So yeah, it's a thing you should always be asking, I think, at every point of the game design. Yeah.
You had touched on actually iconography and that type of thing, and one of the things that I've noticed in your games, and this is actually consistent in through the trilogies and actually even to a degree in Legacy of You, is your wooden characters are similar, your resources look similar, a piece of wood looks like a piece of wood from game to game. The iconography is consistent throughout. Is that something you think about as well? Was that the plan from the get-go, or did that kind of evolve as well?
Yeah, that's another part of brand building, I think, and just familiarity with games. So when someone plays Shipwrights and they see the little bits of wool or the iron or whatever it is, and they get some workers and they play Raiders, they go, oh, I've seen these pieces before. It kind of takes away that I guess that daunting feeling of when you open a game and you go, whoa, what do all these pieces do? What do these cards do? If you can see something familiar in the box, then it kind of helps a bit. I think it helps it be easier to digest the game. I've just got 2 massive games recently that I've opened the box to and gone, crap, what? These are going to take a long time just to learn and jump into because I have no idea what's going on in these boxes. So if we can try and stop that for players, then I think it's a good thing. So we often use the same card formats, especially from Paladins forwards. We kind of use very similar card formats. We try and keep the colors consistent if we can between games. So I think from Paladins onwards, all of the sort of the townsfolk, your crew or whatever you want to call it, they're usually a green card. So that wasn't as consistent moving back. I think it was blue and black for Raiders and blue for Architects. So there's things that aren't consistent throughout, but moving forward, we're trying to make sure that if we use something in one game, it's there in the other game as well. I think it just helps players. Yeah. Why would you want to reinvent every single game, really?
And with that in mind, can you talk about a bit about your artist and how you found him, and then go into how much of that design input is his versus how much of it is yours? Is there back and forth? Where does Sam fit into this?
Yeah, so I guess we'll just talk a bit about who we use and stuff. So for the North Sea, the West Kingdom kind of stuff, we use the Micho from Macedonia. So the first trilogy, the North Trilogy, was basically me doing everything except for the artwork. I can't draw to save my life, but I do all the graphic design and everything for those games. So for that kind of stuff, it's basically I'll ask him to draw certain things. So can I get 10 male, 10 female of these characters, range of diversity and age, and just give me these. This could be a fisherman, it could be a weaver, and just give him brief details like that. Unless I want something more specific, I'll just give him very general direction, and he just knocks it out of the park every time. There's maybe been twice, I think, the whole time that I've asked him to redo something. He has redone things himself. He just goes he'll send me something no, this is rubbish, I'll do it again. So that's great. And then for our other things, my brother is the artist for other games, and obviously Sam McDonald does a lot of design work as well. So, and we've got Bobby Hill that designed Hadrian's Wall. So as an example for Hadrian's Wall, Bobby being the sole designer for that game, he would do his own version of the game. He'd be testing it and developing it with me a bit. Then I'll jump on board. I'll basically do my new version of his game. So I will change all the icons and layouts and things, make things fit on the sheet how I think they need to fit. And then I'll give my version to my brother to then do his final illustration version of it. So it's kind of the middleman doing the art direction and stuff for those ones. But with that, I have to then go get the stuff from my brother, go back to Bobby. Does this work? Is this correct? So kind of going back and forth a bit. So, and for my own stuff, when I'm doing design and graphic design, I find that quite inspiring. Or when I'm doing the graphic design, that kind of inspires like the mechanisms quite a bit too. As I'm using Illustrator to mock up boards or cards, that might spark ideas like, actually, if I move this here and change this thing, maybe that could, that could be better for the game, or that might inspire a new part of the game. So that's for me. I find that graphic design is quite a cool part of the design process. Whereas most people just be like pen and paper or whatever, whiteboard, rip up cards, that kind of stuff. But I find that digital element of graphic design actually to be quite good for my own personal game design process.
Cool. Any other questions out there? Come on, Eric.
What has been one or two of your biggest hurdles production-wise, like actually getting the game into shops and stuff like that, from conception to the shops?
Yeah, the biggest things really are like shipping and distribution. They're the hardest things to do. For the shipping, I kind of just fell into it a bit. When I did my first Kickstarter, I had a few people offering to help me with their services. And I've been through about 8 different shipping companies since then, just trying to find the right one. So that's always a challenge, to get your games from China or wherever else to various ports around the world. But once those systems are in place, it sort of manages itself. The bigger challenge for me, which I basically gave up on in the end, was getting our games into stores. I tried a few times. I'd used one distributor in the US, and it had just been a nightmare. Although they were great, but moving stock from one warehouse to another, I think I lost about $6,000 worth of stock and damages. And you're selling the game for 40% of the retail price, so you're not making much money on these games. So any losses is huge. But fortunately for us, we got the Kenner Spiel nomination for Raiders. I had 3 US publishers chasing us for the license. We ended up going with Renegade, so Renegade now handle all of our distribution stuff. So we're more of a design house than a publisher, really. So our focus is on making the games, developing the product, the final visual stuff, and then they handle all of the actual retail sales. So that's great for us, but it's also very difficult to break into if you're doing it by yourself. You need a lot of people to handle that kind of stuff, all the sales, all the marketing. It's a huge challenge. So I think being in New Zealand especially, it's easy just for us if we can focus just on making the product. We can do the creative stuff, have fun with it, and then have someone else who's a bigger established company handle all of the actual sales and distribution. Yeah.
Along those lines with marketing and sales, how much of a role does the board game YouTube is pretty significant, and how much of a role does Shut Up and Sit Down or Dice Tower or Brothers Murph or any of these people play, and does that make you nervous sometimes when you see Z Garcia up there talking about your new game?
Yeah, I think when you're first starting out with like your first, second, or third game, like those reviews can really make or break a game. I had a friend early on that was publishing at the same time as me in the US, and he released his, I think, second or third game, and it got a terrible review from Tom Vassell, and the game just stopped selling, just overnight, just no one bought it anymore. So that can be brutal for a company. We're at a good place now where we have our own reputation, like we have our brand built, so people aren't discovering us so much. They've probably heard of us. They may not have played our games, but they have a general idea of who we are. So we already have quite a strong following that will just buy stuff regardless of what Tom says or whatever. But that kind of exposure, like if Shut Up and Sit Down really love a game, that's going to be massive for sales, because I think they call it the Shut Up and Sit Down effect. If they like a game, then it just starts selling like crazy. So But yeah, I try not to think about it too much. But we just focus on making great games that we love to play. That's our kind of a focus. We're not trying to impress the reviewers, not trying to make a game that sells 1 million copies. We're just trying to make games that we love playing. And it's just always been our focus. So as long as we keep doing that, hopefully we keep finding people that also like these games that we're making. So.
And on games, we talked about solo, and so do you see yourself looking at larger player count games? A lot of your games are the standard 2 to 4 with a solo mode. Architects will expand up to 6, but is that kind of your sweet spot, or do you think, oh, this is going to be just 3 players the sweet spot for this, or actually I would really like to do an 8-player game? I mean, I don't know if a captain's sonar, but something like that. Does that have any interest to you, or is it just a new challenge? Or
I wouldn't say no to it. I only have 3 friends, so it's a bit hard to get to 8 people, isn't it? No, I used to play a lot of those games early on. I still like Deception, Murder in Hong Kong. That's a great game, which plays higher player counts. But yeah, I don't do as much social gaming as I used to when I started. Most of my gaming is with a few friends here and there, or with other designers, really, in a small kind of group. And we do a lot of testing online on TTS for our own games. So that's like probably 80% of my gaming is testing our own games. But no, I wouldn't say no to high player count. It's just most of the games we make now are quite complex and long. So the more players you add, the longer those games go. But who knows, if I somehow stumbled into designing the next code names, I wouldn't say no to it.
How important is playtesting for you? And at what point do you think, all right, this game's it's been in the oven long enough that I'm ready to put it out to a limited public?
Yeah, it's so important. We play our games every day, twice a day probably. We have usually about 5 to 8 projects on the go at once, so we're always testing constantly. We have a good group of people through our Discord server that test online through TTS. But you basically, when you start designing the game, we test in-house, just 2 of us or 3 of us playing the game quite a bit, making massive changes. So we'll play the game, we might even stop playing after 20 minutes and just talk for like an hour or 2, making all the changes, and then we'll come back the next day, play it again, and make more changes. And eventually you stop making changes, and that's when the game's pretty much done. So we just keep making those changes over and over again. Then we'll open up the testing to a wider group, and we'll get more that sort of first-time feedback that we need to know, is the game good on your first play, and then we'll make more changes based on that. But yeah, then it's really like testing the rule book, making sure that's intuitive and clear and everything. But yeah, the testing could just go on forever. That's the honest truth. We could just keep testing and testing and never stop. But we have to stop at some point. So it's when we feel like there's nothing more that's going to drastically change the game. Any other testing that or changes we'd make after that point would be like, I'll change that 3 to a 4 on that one card, very small things. But we usually get to that earlier in the process, because the first part's all about feel, and how the game is enjoyable and where the fun is in the game. And then the middle part of development is more about balance, which we just do by feel, basically. Just keep playing it, tweaking things here and there and changing them.
And so with that, you've got a reputation, a very good one, I think, for developing games that are complete to start with. They're not, stuff's not removed and the expansion is then sold immediately, but you do add expansions to your games as time goes on. So what's the motivation for expansions? How do you decide which game is going to get one, or how many? I know in the West Kingdom trilogy, I think you've got 2 for Architects. Is there 2 for Viscounts, and then 1 for Paladins, I think? So what makes you decide, okay, this does need an expansion, or this needs 2 expansions? And what's the motivation behind that?
So for the North Sea, it was more about, this is the thing to do. It was like the culture of Kickstarter and all that. So Raiders got that massive buzz. Actually, it's before that, actually, that did it. Raiders was always getting a lot of buzz from just people playing the game. And I think I had some ideas for expansions at that point. I designed Hall of Heroes for it quite early on, and then I think there would have been around about maybe July, August, the year before it went on Kickstarter. So I had like another 8 to 9 months sitting there going, well, I could make a second expansion. Why not? Give something else a try. And those expansions were more of a reaction to people's initial plays. Big comments I got was like, there's not enough iron in the game, and the raids don't feel fun enough. There was like these 2 kind of different angles, very similar comments like that coming in. So Hall of Heroes addresses the economy of the game, gives new ways to do things, to get iron, to get armor and stuff. and Fields of Fame brings in a bit more flavor and fun and chaos with the raiding. So they were more reactions to people getting the game. And then by the time I did Rocks of Ruin for Explorers, it was just like, oh, of course you make an expansion for a game, it's just what you do. And then for all of those West and South games, now it's just people kind of expect an expansion. So we don't want to, fall down on that. We want to make sure people get what they kind of expect. For Viscounts, we did one expansion first, and then we knew we wanted to do a collector's box for that final Kickstarter because we already had done them for Architects and Paladins, but we weren't really done with Viscounts. We were still having fun playing the game and exploring the game. And because it's a deck builder, there's lots of ways to expand it. So we just decided to do 2 expansions, because if we're going to do a big box now, we don't want to like do an expansion in a big box and then bring out another expansion later. And sorry, it doesn't fit in the big box anymore. So it was our way of kind of making sure that everything fits in that box, kind of. But for Ancient Anthology, I basically decided not to do expansions. I want those games to be like smaller boxes and they're done. So you get the game, you're not going to be like forking out more money in the future. You're getting a solid game from the start. So, whereas the medieval stuff, there is the expectation for expansions. So we want to deliver on that. Yeah.
I've not played it, but is Raiders of Scythia is based on Raiders of the North Sea, and
yep.
So but incorporating some of the stuff you did in the expansions, if I understand, for North Sea, was that?
Yeah. So that was me looking back over 5 years since I first started working on the game, and how much I'd learned in those 5 years, and I wanted to go back and just basically do a new version of Raiders, how I would design it now. So it does have some elements from the expansions. It merges 2 different elements together. So there's offerings in the North Sea base game, then there's quests in one of the expansions, All the Heroes. So I kind of merged them together for the quests in Scythia. And it was just, taking the theme and changing things based on the theme. So whereas the Vikings wanted to die gloriously in battle with the Valkyrie, as far as I could tell from my research, the Scythians didn't actually want to die. So there's no reason to give them glory in battle. They wanted to live and be, prosperous. So I had changed things there. They were known for their horseback riding and their recurved bows. So bringing in the theme helped inspire some different stuff there as well. So they're definitely very similar games, but slightly different tweaks on them.
And was that kind of the motivation as well, to keep them kind of separated out? And that's why the art is Sam's art rather than.
Yeah, that was the other side of it. Was here's an opportunity to take a really popular game of ours and redo it, and then use that to launch a new line of games. So that was the first game in the Ancient Anthology.
Cool. Does anyone else have any other questions here before we wrap this up? Nope. Okay, I think we've kept you long enough. Thank you so much for your time, Shem. I really appreciate it, and all the support you've given to this first event. Thank you so much, and best of luck